Good morning, everyone, and thank you for coming to today's session, and good evening to Ava as well. So I'm really looking forward to today's session. Thank you so much, Ava, for coming to talk to us. So Ava Elissic is from the University of Melbourne in Australia. So it's currently evening time there, and she's an associate professor specialising in child trauma and recovery. And the title of her talk is When Everything is Turned Upside Down. And she's going to talk about her research with children who are bereaved as a result of fatal domestic abuse, specifically thinking about the needs and perspectives of the children who are left behind. Ava has also got other resources which she will share with us after the seminar. The session is being recorded. So thank you very much, Ava. If people post questions into the chat, I will ask them at the end, hopefully Ava will be able to respond to your reflections, your queries and your questions. So thank you very much, Ava. We really appreciate you giving us your time.
Thanks so much, Alison, and wonderful to be here. Hello, everybody, and welcome to this presentation on children and young people bereaved by domestic homicide. As Alison already said, I work in Melbourne in Australia, and apart from the research, I also do some clinical work in more general youth mental health. My background is in psychology and social sciences in the Netherlands, as you can probably hear my accent. And today we'll focus on children and young people on that very extreme end of domestic violence. Before I dive into it, though, I would like to acknowledge that I am zooming in from lands that have been taken from the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and that is located here in Naarm, that's now known as Melbourne. And I would like to pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging, and acknowledge that sovereignty of this land was actually never ceded. And there's a lot of violence in this local history that we're yet to reckon with. That also brings me to underrepresented voices, and children are often neglected as people with an important voice, and that definitely applies to young people who have been victims of domestic violence and domestic homicide. And for example, in many countries, there are actually no statistics about how many children are affected. In particular, I'm talking about domestic homicide in this case. And that neglect is about the impact on children, but also about their capacity to engage. And Jane Callahan, who some of you may know, she wrote in 2017 that the failure to talk to children and young people about their lived experience of domestic violence underestimates their capacity for agency. I'll get back to that. So when children are bereaved by domestic homicide, they actually at once are confronted with multiple losses. So one parent is deceased. In many cases, the other parent is in prison or has committed suicide. They often lose their home. They lose school in many cases. And if not that, then the relation with peers and friends and families all of a sudden disrupted, and also their identity is disrupted. All of a sudden they are the child of a victim, and in many cases also the child of a murderer. And there's many fundamental decisions that are made about a child's life: where to live, whether to have contact with a parent in prison, and if so, how and how much, what kind of mental health care, how to support their new home, how do we talk about the deceased and the perpetrator, and then lots of questions around how do we go about it at school. And all these decisions, they shape children's lives, and they've traditionally had very little to say about those fundamental decisions. So yeah, coming back to Jane's quote there a moment ago. And often adults want to think that children have not been affected or not been affected that much. And what we often hear actually anecdotally is that adults think that the children didn't really kind of realize a lot. Often that is then discounted by the stories that the children themselves tell or show, as you see in this quote by a caregiver who said, "You don't want to believe it, but during the first 3, if not 4 years, the child in her care woke up every night without skipping a night. And when the bedwetting also continued, we said, yes, something has to be done here." And then they got into action, fortunately, for this young person. So we see impact on children after domestic homicide across a range of domains. And you see them at the bottom there in that picture. That's psychological, so post-traumatic stress disorder, traumatic grief. We see lots of intrusive thoughts. We see social consequences. Attachment is a big one, and getting that connection and attachment to new caregivers, finding a balance there. But also social connections with peers. Some children are getting withdrawn, other children show behavior problems. Physical consequences, we also see sometimes weight changes, asthma, came up in one of the papers that we reviewed. So we put this whole picture together based on a systematic review of the literature. And another element there that came up was sleep difficulties. And that obviously, like any of these issues actually, they then also affect other things, like, for example, academic performance, and children struggling with keeping up at school. Or sometimes we also see that performance at school is the thing that they hold on to and that they actually do really well in. So obviously it's not easy to predict what will happen, but we see across the literature and also our own clinical experience a range of different potential outcomes and combinations of these. And there are different types of factors that affect that, and we've grouped them here in those before the homicide, during the homicide, and after the homicide, and we'll touch on a couple of these. So I wanted to give you a little bit of information about some of the stats, so some background on children's exposure and experience, and I'll do that based on a study that we did in the Netherlands. That was a population-based study. What we did was we started with a big exercise in identifying all the cases over a period of 10 years, 2003 to 2012. And we cross-examined 8 different data sources, so from legal databases to media information, criminology database, our own, and some clinical databases. So we cross-examined those, and we're fairly confident in saying plus or minus 1, we really were able to identify all of these children, like to be able to count them, because as I said previously, there's very little information about how many children are affected. So in the Netherlands, which has a population of about 16 million at the time, there were 256 children who had been bereaved by domestic homicide. And we then looked at as many case files as we could get to describe their circumstances and demographics, etc. So we did that for 170 children. And then as the final step, we interviewed children and caregivers, and sometimes professional guardians, about the children and young people and how they had how they had been in the last few years since the homicide happened. And one of the things that was, I think, a strength of that study was that we could see how well our interview study was representative of the full population of children affected. And as I'll talk about a little bit in a moment, we definitely did have a biased group in the end, but still a lot of information in there. So some of those stats. On average, the children were 7 years old when the homicide happened. 2/3 were younger than 10. And that's a relevant fact in the sense that it means that a large proportion of children are actually not yet, sometimes don't have a full concept of what death means, or their vocabulary around emotions is still developing. So that may be really important to address when providing support for these children. Then 87% of these children lost their mothers, so the large majority. A small number of children lost their father. Previous violence and neglect at home was frequent, and in 83% of the cases that was likely or certain. And when we looked at the most robust data on previous violence, we found that of the 116 kids for whom that was kind of confirmed, 43% had not received social or mental health care services before the homicide. So they had not been seen by services. And for 16%, it was unclear. So it could be that well over 50% had not received services previously. So imagine the burden on these children already when there was violence at home. And then on top of that, there was eventually the homicide. So in terms of what they were exposed to, 80% of the homicides happened at home. And in many cases, the children were on location. So often, the story was the children were asleep. Anecdotally, we then later hear details that the kids probably couldn't know if they were really entirely asleep, but really good to realize that most homicides happen at home, and even if the children didn't directly witness the homicide, they were often still confronted with the aftermath, and the home became a crime scene. So often sealed or not accessible for the children, and they often had to move out in any case. Also, in terms of the weapons used, the most used weapon was a cutting weapon, followed by firearms, which meant that when the children were at home, they were often exposed to graphic scenes. More than 50% of the children had an immigration background, so either their parents or they themselves had been born abroad. And that's a high number within this group compared to the general population, where it was about 21% at the time. So an overrepresentation of children with a migration background, which our thinking is a proxy for socioeconomic status. And we didn't get that high representation in our interview. So it's really, I feel that we need to be much better going forward in including people from a culturally diverse background in our services and as well in the research. So we've really missed out there. So good to keep that in mind when going through the next few findings. So in terms of the interview insights, those were regarding 40 children and young people. We interviewed over 60 people, but it was a mix of kids themselves and caregivers. And what came out was a fragile balance. So in many cases, we were very impressed by how well children and young people were functioning, but it was still clearly and totally understandably a major influence on their daily life. One example that still sticks with me is a family that had cameras around the house for fear of when the perpetrator would be released. So while they were functioning really well, just this major cloud over their head on a daily basis. Also, we did interviews quite a few years post-homicide in many cases, and the grief symptoms that caregivers were still dealing with themselves were quite substantial. So it really raised this point of the need to support caregivers from the very start, but also in the long term, and provide them with support to be a support for the children. So many cases, grandparents, of course, who are looking after the kids. Often we saw conflict between the sides of the family about, for example, well, what the story was, or where the children should live, and children could really get caught in loyalty issues there. What we also saw was a lack of continuity in professional support. So, as is the case in many countries, there was quite a bit of turnover in child protection staff and placement support workers, etc. And that came with having to tell your story every time over and over again. Pressure regarding contact with the perpetrator came up as well. So the families that we spoke with experienced pressure, for example, in their experience from youth services to remain in contact with the perpetrator, and for children to go to prison, for example, and have regular visits, while the caregivers often saw that a child would respond with, for example, behavior problems or stress in relation to that contact. Another big source for stress was legal procedures, and these are so often so drawn out that they lead to a lot of uncertainty, and for children that definitely came with extra distress. And for example, children not being sure whether they can stay with their current caregivers, or a concern about a contact request made by a perpetrator, and being stressed about having to have contact later on. Now, I wanted to zoom in particular on the voices of children and young people in relation to that quote that we looked at the start with Jane about their voices being underrepresented. So when we look at their perspectives, I'm going to talk specifically about that question around contact with the perpetrator. And one of the key things that came out was how different children's and young people's perspectives are, and that we really have to ask them, because we can't predict. Even within one family, across among siblings, children could have very different perspectives on contact with a perpetrator and what they wanted in that space. And one of the key questions is, of course, is having contact beneficial, or is it harmful? For which purpose are we actually doing it? And what we saw in the interviews with the children was that overall, in our interviews, they expressed quite a negative view on contact with their parent. Several expressed fear, also for when the perpetrator would be released. And one wondered whether she kept going to see her parent for his sake rather than her own, and thought it was actually more for him than for her. And caregivers, as I said previously, observed distress, especially with younger children, for example, an increase in sleeping problems after contact had happened. So that was kind of a overall theme that we saw about this general negative view on the issue of contact. However, there was a lot of variation. And this is one of the children who said, when he was still allowed to see me, I went to the prison very often. And then he started the court case. We won it. I don't want anything to do with him now. Actually, I want him to leave me in peace and that he doesn't nag me so much anymore. then this young person said, in the past, my father was actually a very good person for me because he always went horse riding with me and such things. And then suddenly my father simply, who I trusted most and who I loved most, had done something very nasty. So for this young person, it may be a totally different consideration about contact and what might make contact something that is helpful for her. And then this is another young person, not from our study, but an Australian young person. And she said in the media this: people forget that my dad is serving time, but I am as well. And so for her, she was feeling very attached to her father, perpetrator. And so her response to contact, questions about contact would be totally different again. And then the other thing that came up in our in these interviews is that the reasons for contact were quite varied. And so there were young people who wanted to actually check whether they looked like their parents. So there was a curiosity and they wanted to, maybe as a one-off, but wanted to see their parent. And it had this implied notion of concern about becoming like the perpetrator later in life. Will I be like my dad? And wanting to get a sense of that. So understanding was a reason there. And then other children wanted answers from their parent in prison about what happened, or wanted to know things about the deceased parent that parent, the surviving parent, might be able to answer. So this is a list, for example, by a child who asked questions. Do you think a lot of mum on her birthday? Have you seen mum's grave? Don't you have, a tendency or a wish to go there? What happened upstairs? So all these questions, and in some cases, perpetrators are able to provide some answers. Especially the issue of remorse is an important one for the children in our interviews that came up, and can be a difficult one to address. So there's so many aspects to take into account with this question of contact. But what came out so clearly for us was that we need to ask and observe what is important for the children themselves. So currently, colleagues of ours are actually interviewing in the UK. So I did want to mention that they were doing this large project currently in the UK and in Australia to understand young people and adults with lived experience stories, caregivers and family friends and professionals' experiences as well, to really hone in on their voice, and in particular with regard to young people and adults with lived experience, to hear what they find important topics. And we look in particular around the themes of home, relationships and identity, but are very open to anything that people with lived experience find important. So it's very flexible in that sense. So if anybody is interested, or somebody who might be wanting to share their story as somebody with lived experience, or as a caregiver or professional, they're very welcome. And Professor John Devani is organizing that and leading that in Edinburgh. So I've put his contact details there, and I might put them in the chat later on as well, if that's helpful. And now I wanted to move to the most important part, and that is to listen to some of the people who have lived experience. And today I'll share Catherine's story, Catherine has become a dear friend and colleague, and her father killed her mother when she was just a few months old. And I will play this audio for you. It's about 7 minutes, and afterwards I'll also share a video. But we'll start with her story, where she talks about a situation when she was an adolescent. Just start that.
I'm 12 years old and in my first year of high school, and a new friend asks me what my mother does for a living. I'm standing in the doorway of a classroom and I can't move. Everything inside me feels chaotic, a jumbled mess of thoughts and feelings, my brain scrambling for the right words to get me out of the conversation that I know is about to occur. I feel my new friend staring at me, waiting for an answer that I don't know how to give. She's dead, I said quietly. My stomach turns as I wait for the follow-up question. It always comes. Kids are curious and not well versed in social cues. How did she die? He asks. And my face turns red and there is this hollow, nauseous ache in my guts that I would later come to recognize as shame. I say nothing because I don't really know. I don't know how to explain it. Nobody has ever really explained it to me. How did she die? He asks again. It is an odd feeling to want so desperately to be understood, to be seen, and in equal measure, to disappear, become invisible. I don't want to talk about it, I say, and I brace myself for what's next. But all he does is shrug and say, okay, sorry, and he walks away. But I still wonder if somehow he just knows, like my face gives something away. And I realize I haven't taken a breath in a really long time, and I want to cry or scream, but my class is about to start. So I pack up my bag and all of my feelings, and I put them away somewhere, because they're confusing and I don't understand them. And then, all of a sudden, I feel nothing at all. If it's possible to feel less than nothing, inhuman somehow, I feel that. And I don't understand that either. I don't understand what's wrong with me, but I know something is really, really wrong with me. In that moment, it's the only thing I know for sure. In the following years, whenever the question was asked, I would say car accident or cancer. No less tragic, of course. However, I was already keenly aware, far more socially acceptable. I got good at lying. Another thing to feel ashamed about, but somehow less shameful than the truth. My dad killed her. I never knew how to say that out loud. I am afraid of him. I never knew how to say that either. On January 31st, 1985, my father got a gun and shot my mother, Carolyn, 3 times in our family home. I was 3 months old, my brothers 4 and 8. My father served 3 years of an 8-year sentence for manslaughter, the Provocation Defense. In what I assume was an effort to keep us out of the system, my brothers and I were informally fostered, looked after by family, friends, and relatives of my father while he was in prison. We each lived with separate carers because no one person could take us all. I often wonder what that must have been like for us as small humans. A dead mother, a father in prison, and then to be separated from each other. Carers who were suffering through their own complicated trauma and grieving process. Nobody keeping tabs. My heart feels heavy for those children. It is sometimes easier to feel for them back there in the past than for myself here in the present. Upon my father's release from prison, my brothers and I went back to live in the family home with him. My attachment to my foster family seemingly irrelevant at this juncture. My father wanted us back. So most of my childhood was spent in that house, with my father as my primary carer. It is a lonely feeling to love someone who you fear, to want to protect someone who has hurt you so much, to feel unsafe in a place, a home, but perhaps more unsafe outside of it, because the world feels terrifying when the people that are supposed to love you the most are the ones that hurt you. It feels like if they can do it, anyone can, and better the devil you know. I wasn't asked at any point if I wanted to live with him. I don't remember ever being asked anything. Though I realised later that part of the reason he served so little of his sentence was because they were keen to get him back to his family, his job, his life. As far as I could tell, everything was in his best interests, and nothing was in ours. I don't really blame people for not advocating for us. Folks had their own trauma to deal with, and they were up against a system and a society that saw my father as a victim. He was a white, well-educated, middle-class man, and my mother had betrayed him. But I do continue to be amazed that nobody once asked me if I was okay living in that house with him, or with my brothers, for that matter. They were angry, understandably, justifiably. We all were. Though my fear trumped my anger, and my anger manifested quite differently than my brother's. Mine turned inward, theirs outward. I spent a lot of years searching for answers, searching for ways to be okay. I searched for validation, for understanding, for connection, for community, for safety. I searched in places that I probably shouldn't have, places and people that were far from safe. I found myself in situations that I look back on in sadness and regret and fear. I searched for a way out of the life I was born into. I searched for a way into something more meaningful. I searched for information, for education, for mental health support, for similar stories, for peace of mind. Some of those things I have found, others I still search for. Perhaps I always will. Somewhat ironically, the thing that protected my father from his crimes, from taking responsibility, is the same thing that has protected me, kept me relatively safe, helped me be a somewhat functioning human being in the world. Privilege. I have quite a lot of it. Many people in my situation do not. And I also fought hard to be okay. I fought for myself and by myself for a very long time. I fought for professional help, for a support network, for my freedom and for my sanity. I fought for access to information about my own life. I fought to have a voice. And it is exhausting to fight for these things, and it is expensive, and it has taken up a lot of space and time in my life. It has taken a lot out of me and from me. And there were so many things I had to do alone that I wish I could have done with the help of others. And I have others now, but there are still days that feel impossibly hard. Living with childhood trauma is complicated, to say the least. Traumatic grief, disenfranchised grief, is complicated. It is both personal and political, and healing becomes somewhat dependent on both your own understanding of what has occurred and society's understanding and acknowledgement of what has occurred. It is a difficult road, and nobody should have to travel it alone.
Catherine there. And while you're pondering her words, I would invite you, if you like, to just put in the chat any reflections there, anything it makes you think of. Doesn't need to be a long story, but just any responses that you have to this audio. While you're doing that, I'll go to the next thing and give you my contact details in case that is handy. And I will, in a moment, open a video also with Catherine. There you go. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you so much, Ava. That was incredibly profound and moving, and I'm sure everybody, will have felt the same. And yeah, just processing it really. We have got some questions which I'll put to you, and I'm sure more will emerge as we go. The first one was, has the Netherlands study been published yet? And that was from Ludovine Garside.
Yeah, yes, it has been. And I will send you some information. I will include some links because they have also been published open access, and I can obviously share a few publications easily. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. The second question is from Mia Holsing. So hi, Mia, haven't seen you for some time. Lovely to know you're here. What proportion of children are cared for by family members compared to being in care in your study?
It's a good one. I would need to look up the exact numbers, but I need to look it up. I thought there was a quite big group of children who were living with grandparents or family in some cases, in some way, and then a few children with professional carers or like residential options. And then a few people who were children where we were with, like we call that in the network. So it might be friends of the family, but not family themselves.
Yeah,
a bit of a mix.
Okay, and do you know, just picking up really from Catherine's story, whether siblings were kept together in your study or were they separated?
It was also varied. Yeah, there were children. We had all kinds of stories in that regard. Children who were initially kept together, but then it turned out that it was just not feasible for the foster carers to keep them together. For example, with one child, it didn't gel very well, or there was just not enough space. Sometimes the very practical consideration of not having enough rooms in the house to take in, for example, 3 children. So sometimes they were together and sometimes they weren't. And in the case of Catherine, for example, as well, she eventually, part of the story is split and part of it is together.
Yeah. I mean, lots of comments about Catherine's story, being shocked about the shortness of the sentence and being very surprised that her mother's family weren't drawn upon to support the children. That seems quite shocking in those circumstances.
Yeah, I always think, I mean, apart from Catherine's specific situation, it is such a case-by-case scenario, because sometimes the family from the mother's side or the victim's side is the right place for a child, and it's super helpful to have caring people who they know. At the same time, for often the grandparents, it is a terribly tough time for them as well to grieve the loss of their daughter, and to be available emotionally for a child or children at the same time can be so tough and taxing, even though they might want to do it. So there's so many considerations in that moment, and what is available in terms of support to make that possible makes a big difference.
Yeah, I guess I hadn't particularly thought about the grief and the impact on, which might make them less able to care at that moment. There's another question here from Caroline Castle, who says, are you able to outline recommendations for support interventions for children?
Yeah. Unfortunately, no easy checklist to do, but a number of questions we definitely have always. So in my mind, it's always good to have mental health support available. Even though children may show incredible resilience and caregivers may show incredible resilience, that they have so much to deal with after this homicide. And as we discussed previously, often there is a history of domestic violence already, so there is this pile of things to deal with. And so I think mental health support is absolutely, in many cases, necessary and welcome. And of course, that needs to be tailored again to what the children need. A consideration of whether family conflict might emerge and whether there's any proactive mediation that can happen. A lot of support. Sometimes we've spoken with people here, also in Australia, who just needed practical support, for example, financial support, and not having easy, accessible information about what is available if you all of a sudden have 2 children in your home and need to look after them. That has financial consequences. So kind of support with navigating the system. And then there's so many aspects to it, and at different time points there are different needs. So in the acute aftermath, there are some practical needs, there's some mental health support, some support for the school about how to go about managing this in the classroom, and how we don't or we do talk about it, and how we make sure that the child feels that they can be there with their whole self and this whole situation. And then longer term questions maybe around contact with other people who have been in similar situations. So yeah, I've got a list of questions that we might want to look at without prescribing exactly what should be done and how, but yeah, I hope that gives some input.
Thank you. We've got a comment here from Laura Reid, just saying how powerful it was, and thank you very much, that she's researching in the area and exploring children and young people's views and experiences of being heard in domestic homicide reviews. And, Catherine's story was very pertinent, because she's finding that the systems we work with make it very difficult for children's voices to be heard. And similarly, I have done some analysis of domestic homicide reviews and adult practice reviews, and children's voices are completely missing from those. Laura Stockgate has just noted, I agree. I think it's having that trusted adult relationship and also support to help children feel more empowered. Yeah, I mean, I was also thinking that I guess it's quite a different situation if the homicides happened in a retaliatory sense because of ongoing domestic abuse. And, quite often that does happen, doesn't it, as a very last sort of, and I presume the children's experience is different in terms of their understanding as a result of that. I don't know if that was the case in some of your interviewees.
Yeah, they're different dynamics and also some similarities. I must say the numbers are much smaller in terms of what we have been able to do in the research. So I can't talk about any general insights, but what we've seen occasionally is indeed a different story, not always, but in many cases. Maybe more willingness to maintain contact, but also there occasionally we've heard of children who are afraid of their parent, and especially a young person, like younger children. So difficult to understand. Like, very young children have occasionally expressed, irrespective of who the perpetrator was, but just the fear of, can I be a victim as well? And so, yeah, I can't really give you any general insights. I think it's a really important one to look into more in the future.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I was thinking about is how important it is, or I think, Catherine articulated this, to have some kind of narrative for themselves. And I'm doing a piece of research, which I mentioned to you earlier, about mothers in prison, some of whom have killed their partners, and children's contact. And life story work seems quite important for children to be able to articulate and put a narrative around and understand. Is that anything that's come up?
Yeah, well, what does definitely come up is that in different stages, there are different questions for kids. And as I mentioned previously, these questions around, am I might I develop into, looking like or being like my perpetrator parent, or what is the story there? Questions around how do I engage with my direct environment? What Catherine also said in her in the audio piece around feeling like you have to lie because that's the only way out, or the only way to kind of keep it manageable. How do you deal with that, and how do you reconcile that with values that you want to adhere to? And so narrative work seems really relevant in that space, and may evolve over time. And what we've talked about with Catherine as well is that we took these videos, the initial footage was a few years ago, and now she would see some things even different again, and it's just ongoing. There's not a point in time that the story is round and complete and wrapped up. It's ongoing.
Yeah. Just another comment here from Caroline Castle saying that I'm reflecting on how we build a therapeutic community for a child in these circumstances. I don't know if you've got any thoughts on that, Ava.
Yeah. So it seems like, from what we've seen in our interviews and engagement with children and young people and their environments, is that there are also so many options for support, actually. Like, there have been children who talked with us about the teachers that have been so supportive, or the school welfare person, or of course caregivers, friends, and maybe in different combinations, but there are options for really constructive and long-term support. One of the things that stood out for me was this necessity for us to bring some stability where we can, and when we see so much turnover in professional services, how can we make sure that there's still some anchor points? And for some kids, that has been a mental health care provider who they've worked with for years and feel really, really comfortable with, and find it easy to go back to. Like, sometimes it feels like it would be good to have an option for young people to dip in and dip out of support. Like, the service knows them, and they come when something news might come up, right? When there are maybe milestones that bring a few new questions or new distress to the service, and then they can support them. So my thoughts are, yes, we can build a support network, and it might have a different kind of constellation depending on a specific child and their situation and their family context, for example, and their community context. And for us really to think of those opportunities, like, where could we provide some longer term support and equip people to provide that.
And have there been peer support groups for young people who?
Yeah, in the Netherlands there has been, mostly initially focused on adults, but then they also would organize activities for children. There, in Australia, as far as we know, there hasn't been such a group, but through the research, we are actually connecting now with a number of people, and we're looking into a way to make sure that they can connect with each other, because for many people, they've expressed that they have never met somebody else who has been in a similar situation. I mean, every story is unique, but and how powerful that can be. Catherine has also spoken with us about that, and was one of her motivations initially to get in touch as well, as to be able to connect with others around this important topic.
Yeah, no, I would have thought that would be really, really important. just final comments in the chat here, just saying the concept of constellation that moves with the child. They really like that concept. So we're coming to 1 minute to 11. So I don't know if you've got any final thoughts, Ava, before I thank you.
I was just thinking on that point of connection, that within the UK, after such an important advocacy group as well. So I'll just put the acronym in there, and I can connect you as well. So if that's of relevance to people, I can include that in the resources.
Thank you. Well, thank you so much. It's made a wonderful contribution to our domestic abuse conference series, and it certainly left me with lots of reflections for other studies that I'm doing and making connections between knowledges. So thank you so much. It was really, really interesting and very, very moving as well. So thank you very much, Ava. Sean's just put a poll in the chat just to get some sense of feedback from people, and if people could just give us a moment to complete that, we'd really appreciate it. And lots of people saying thank you. It's been really insightful, informative, and incredibly moving.